I'm Matt Brown, and you're listening to the Matt Brown Podcast. It's an interesting episode today. London City Council is in the final stage of giving itself a hefty raise. Ward 7 Councillor Corrine Rahman, who voted against the raise, is joining us to help us understand where this is coming from and what might happen next. I'll tell you more about it right after this. Fall is here. It's time to discover Bicycle Cafe. Cozy up with our daily soup and sandwich, or unwind with an evening latte and some Dutch comfort food.
London Bicycle Cafe at the Forks of the Thames. See you soon.
And we're back. London City Council salary could increase by over 35% over the course of the next 4-year term. Their overall budget, almost $8 million, a 50% increase. And this number does not include the cost of city staff who support them or the mayor's budget as well. Right now, a city councillor makes about $67,500 per year. The mayor makes around $163,000 and change. The task force is recommending a pretty substantial increase that would begin in 2027. Depending on the role, a councillor would make between $94,000 to just over $100,000 at the beginning of next term, and in 2030 would top out between $104,000 and $113,000. The mayor would be making $181,000 at that point too. It's an age-old story. City councils in Ontario have to decide their own wages, and London is no exception. Back in 2010, when I was first elected, we used to have a debate each March about whether we should give ourselves a raise. It was a circus. The past few councils have struck task forces of community members who review the job, review what other communities pay their council members, and then make recommendations to council about remuneration adjustments for the next term. Even with this once removed process, the final decision remains with councils, and the debate is just as awkward as it was 15 years ago. So to say this is an uncomfortable position to be in as a member of council, it's an understatement. It's the third rail of municipal politics. It's like being between a rock and a hard place while living in a fishbowl. Ironically, every member of council takes an oath of office at the beginning of their term. They promise to declare any fiduciary conflict of interest, and they abstain from any vote that could benefit them monetarily, except for deciding their own pay. And that's what's happening now. A task force has studied London Council's workload, has come back with a series of recommendations. These include significant increases for council, beginning right after the next election, a severance package that would be available to them if they lost their seat in a future election, as well as a potential increased budget to contract staff to do constituent work. That one has been referred to a committee for review. I said off the top that if all of these recommendations go through, council's budget could grow to almost $8 million. That's a 50% increase in spending. I am the first to admit that this doesn't include everything. It was difficult to pull these numbers together. I couldn't find information that was readily available about the cost of benefits packages or the mayor's expenses, nor could I easily find information about the cost of staffing support provided to council by civic administration. So I didn't add in the costs associated with adding another assistant in the council office, which was a recommendation from the task force. Nevertheless, I'm confident the numbers I'm sharing with you are accurate and paint an apples to apples picture of the situation. So that's the background. Let's get on with the show. Corrine Rahman is currently serving as the Ward 7 City Councillor. She's a professor at Fanshawe College and a past trustee for the Thames Valley District School Board. She, like many of her colleagues, is very busy. Currently, Corrine serves as the Vice Chair of the Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee, as the Co-Chair of the London Economic Response Team, the Vice Chair of the London Transit Commission, and serves as a board member for London Hydro and the Hyde Park Business Association. As I said off the top, Councillor Rahman voted against the task force recommendations, and she's joining us on this episode to tell us all about it. So let's go. Councillor Corrine Rahman, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So first off, tell us a bit about this task force and what they brought forward at the high level for council's consideration this past week.
Yeah, sure. So I want to start with council asked a community task force made up of selected members from the community to come back with their recommendations on a number of items, council's remuneration, but also looking at things like, should the role be a full-time role? Should councillors receive severance? And also, should we be compensated for agencies, boards, and commissions that we sit on? So those were some of the questions that they looked at. And over the course of many meetings, they evaluated those topics and came back with the report that was in front of us for discussion.
And I think also there was a request for take a look at the supports that you have. Your workloads are
Yes.
very large, and do you have enough help from a constituency perspective and also from a city hall office perspective as well?
Yes. And for those parts of the discussion, we didn't actually fully consider those matters. Instead, we've referred them to our governance working group.
Okay, and then these weren't just random people from the community. These were people with lived experience as city councilors. I think you had a couple of city councilors, past city councilors, I should say, on the task force. You had Professor Emeritus, who is an expert in local government on the task force as well.
Yeah. And, I'm so grateful for the work they did, because it's always good to have their perspective and to have a starting point for these discussions. So I am very thankful for that work that they did.
Okay, okay. And so you mentioned a number of recommendations that were considered, and the report's quite long. Obviously, people are going to focus in on the wage, but there's some other bits of information there as well. And I think they also conducted a survey of counselors and how they spent their time. And the average, I believe, was 51 hours per week of work. And I am sure that almost every counselor works that 51-hour week, and in many cases, more than 51 hours many weeks as well. Can you give us an idea of what a typical day might be like for you, or a typical week?
Is it a weekday or is it a weekend?
Well, let's do both. Let's do weekday and then let's do a weekend,
Well, I'd say this: one, no day is typical.
right?
So there's that. I can tell you that I may spend my time in a day doing a number of things. So, one, I tend to break up my email time into blocks. So, I start with an early morning block of time that I do about an hour and a half to 2 hours of emails. I set aside a reading block in almost every day, because you need it with the amount of committee work that we have.
That's true, because folks listening might not understand that you get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents that aren't light reading, and you have to go through them each and every week.
Yeah, and evaluate what's in front of you, make up your questions that you're going to ask, connect with staff on matters maybe that you need more information on, or about questions or motions that you're working on. So I typically set aside, I would say, about 2 hours a day for that reading block on the days I do not have committee meetings. If I have a heavy week of committees, and that varies, and committees and council, I will say, that varies from week to week. I might be in a committee meeting. Usually a Monday and a Tuesday are most of our meeting dates. With Hydro, some of my other responsibilities, they may meet on Wednesdays and Thursdays and Fridays. But, fitting in that time, typically when we meet, it's usually around 4-hour blocks at least, that we set aside for our meetings. Just depends on which committee. We've also shrunk our standing committees. So there's 3 standing committees. And so we've put more items together, which is good from
Which
the
is
perspective.
efficient, but it makes for a longer meeting.
It can.
Mhm.
And so, we're learning through that process. And we just went through a real evaluation of that exercise as well. Like I said, every day is different, but a lot of time is spent with constituent issues, making phone calls, returning phone calls, and communication with constituents. And then I think what people probably see more of from our city council, if you're involved in social media or anything, is the events and the other
That's
activities.
evenings, that's weekends,
Yes.
and you could be busy every night of the week, and you could be busy every day of the weekend as well.
Absolutely. So tonight, just for an example, on a Saturday, I spent 4 hours doing emails and doing catching up on some work from earlier this week. It was budget. So we had an extra committee meeting this week. So I caught up on that this morning. This evening, I have a dinner that I'm attending. It's a 4-hour event, and I'm there to represent the mayor and the city.
Right. And so 51 hours can go by pretty quickly, and can also, you
Yes.
can hit above that mark pretty easily as well. I think that that's why it's difficult to pick what an appropriate wage would be like, because this is also a public service. So let's talk numbers. Way back in 2010, I had the privilege to serve as Ward 7 councillor in the ward that you represent today. We were making about $35,000. Now, at the time, we also received a tax break for about a third of that money was not taxed. And so the compensation really was more like $42,000, $43,000. These days, a city councilor makes about $67,500 per year. The mayor makes $163,000 in change. And the task force is recommending I'm not going to pass judgment, but I am going to observe that it's a pretty substantial increase that would begin in 2027. So not this term of council, but next term of council. So depending on their role, you know this, but our listeners don't, a councillor will begin making $94,000 in 2027, and that will increase to just over $100,000 at the end of next term. It could top out at $113,000, depending on what responsibilities councillors taken on, whether they're chairing a committee, been named the deputy mayor, or the budget chair. And the mayor, at the end of next term of council, will be making $181,000 at that point too. So you just voted against this and other recommendations that were part of the debate this past weekend. Can you tell us why?
Yes, absolutely. So I will say, as I mentioned, I'm very grateful for the work of the task force, but I did not support the indexing of compensation for councillors to the 70th percentile of the 2020 median full-time income.
And you know what? Can we just pause right there? I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
that's a really important point, because the mechanism that caused the increase to go at a faster rate than it would have given the old model is that it's gone from the 50th percentile to the 70th percentile. Could you just outline what that means for folks listening?
Well, it was what the task force came back with as their recommendation for indexing for compensation. So this is a standard that they use to evaluate where to set our wage or salary, sorry. And it's something that is used in employee groups across the city, within City Hall. And so the terminology is very important, which is why I used it.
Right, right. And I think also when they did their environmental scan, the task force saw that, when you look at the size of the City of London and you look at the salary that a city councillor and the mayor is making, it comes in below average compared to other similar sized municipalities here in Ontario. That's a tricky point, though.
So similar sized municipalities in terms of population, but not similar sized in terms of councils.
Yeah, and I want to go there next, actually. So thanks for bringing that up. What I also wanted to point out was the difficult with using averages is that if, let's say, City A is below average, so they raise the salaries for the council up to the average for City A, B, C, and D. Well, now the average has increased as well, and so it's really a closed system that can cycle nowhere other than up. And he also mentioned that similar sized cities have councils of vastly different number of members who sit on the council. So right now, people probably know there's 15 members of council, 14 councillors, and a mayor. And there can be communities much larger than London that have fewer.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to make something also clear when we're talking about this, that, this is the first term of council that's sitting with strong mayor's powers. And so how strong mayor powers come into the role of a councillor and the types of decisions that we make, that also needs to be evaluated, because in my opinion, decision making has changed since we had the addition of strong mayor powers. I would say that when you look at, for instance, in previous terms of council, how council was involved in the budget process and how the council is involved in the budget process now.
Right. And so, before when I had the privilege to serve on a couple of councils, we would start our budget deliberations in December. We'd be delivered a December present that was a binder with about 2,000 pages in it. We'd spend our holidays in December going through the business cases, essentially, about what the budget could look like for the next year. And then we'd spend most of January and well into February deliberating and debating, maybe ten full days of meetings.
Hmm.
We moved then to a multi-year budget, which you still use.
Hmm.
But what you're saying now is because as a result of strong mayor powers, you don't participate as closely in that process.
The decision making has definitely
Yeah.
changed, and the ability for a counselor to make a change to the budget, in my opinion, it only comes through, of course, through the amendment process, but it is more challenging because you also know that the mayor has the ability to veto.
Yeah. So it's completely different. And so I'm just curious why you raised that change in association with the salaries that we've been discussing.
Yeah, because when you evaluate a job, you evaluate how that individual interacts with decisions in order to decide what the compensation level should be. So for me, when I look at compensation and I look at it from that perspective of what is the difficulty of the job and the type of decision that's
And folks
required.
might not know that you have an HR background, and so that would come naturally to you. And we
Yeah.
talked about the size of council. When I was
Yeah.
mayor, I used to joke that I would really appreciate a smaller council at some council meetings because everybody gets 5 minutes to speak about anything, and so the debate can go on for hours and hours. But in all seriousness, do you think that 14 councillors might be too many?
So what I said was, I believe that the compensation discussion and the ward size discussion should be linked. And I've always supported a smaller council. And I did try to move us towards the discussion during the ward boundary review to a smaller council. And again, it comes back to has the role changed? But as you would know, in Ward 7, we've seen significant growth.
Incredible growth. It may still be the fastest growing ward in the entire city.
Ward Nine's kind of inching their way closer. So, as Ward Seven's been built out, but right now I represent about 47,000 people in the city of London. The smallest ward is about 23,000. So I am comfortable that the job can be done effectively with a population base of about 47,000 and some growth. So, in my opinion, we could have shrunk council. And that needs to be a discussion that we're having as we're having discussions about compensation as well. Because what we heard from the public was, well, yeah, I'd support that if council was smaller.
Okay, that's very interesting. And because these things really are inextricably linked. So
Yes.
you have 47,000 constituents, another ward councillor might have 27,000 constituents. Obviously, that needs to be rebalanced. And that's
Mhm.
happened as a part of this term. The
Yes.
ward boundaries have changed. The Ward 7 has seen a significant change. And then also, I can see your point to total workload. I heard one person present an option to me that if you were to say shrink council down to say 9 or 11 members, so that would be 8 members of council and a mayor, or it would be 10 members of council and a mayor instead of 15. Is that what you're thinking, or do you have a different number in mind?
So, along with the compensation conversation, I would like the province to take on the ward size conversation as well. Once they change Toronto, it's difficult to say, hey, Toronto has 26 councillors and a mayor, or 26, including the mayor, and we should have 15. And I know for a lot of people that's difficult to wrap their heads around because they think as the city grows, you should have more members of council. But things have changed significantly. And like I said, one example is just when it comes to the discussion of strong mayor powers.
Right. And so Toronto is a great example where the premier several years ago basically cut council in half and eliminated
Mm-hmm.
half of the seats. And Toronto is, significantly larger, at least 4 times larger than London.
Yeah.
Last time I looked at the population numbers, they can do it. Also, members of parliament, members of provincial parliament, they represent in the neighborhood of 110,000 constituents. We've got 4 ridings here in the London and area. So it's not like the model doesn't exist. It's about the
Mm-hmm.
process from getting from A to B. And
Right.
really, if you think about the financial benefit to moving to a smaller council, well, you could take the existing budget and you could redistribute it. There'd be no increase to the tax levy, and councillors would be paid a higher wage. It could very well be in the $100,000 range with no really economic impact to the budget.
Exactly. And I think for me, when we start to discuss the issue of how we should be supported, the support model is really important to how you might support a ward differently if it was larger in size. It could have more of a staff complement. And I think that a constituency office model, perhaps still centralized at City Hall, but makes sense in terms of the way that we could function. So those are bigger conversations, obviously, but I think that it's time, if we're going to continue to call ourselves a big city or medium-sized city trying to be a bigger city, we need to start thinking like a bigger city.
Right. And for context, give folks listening an idea of what support is in place now,
Sure.
and then align it with what your vision is for the future.
Yeah, so we have a staffing model currently where we have about half a person supporting us each. So we basically have a shared model, and then we are given a budget where we can use that to help to hire additional people to do work for
And
us.
that's
So
$13,500.
well, that's our entire budget. That includes other expenses for your ward.
Travel, events, sponsorships.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I will say there are challenges with all of that. You're trying to basically find people to do piecework, and it's difficult to do that. They also don't have access to your city email. So there's a lot of limitations to what support they can provide. So for my case, I have some help with my newsletter, with social media. That tends to be the extent of the support that I receive.
Yeah, and listening to the number of hours that you're doing email in a day. I also
Mhm.
looked at one of the graphs that was included in the task force
Yes.
report, and there has been just incredible growth in terms of the number of emails that are being received.
Yes. Yeah, it definitely has changed in the way people are communicating with you. But I will say part of the challenge I have is communication comes in all forms. So my LinkedIn, my Instagram, my Facebook, and everywhere else, people want to communicate with you in the most the quickest, most immediate way. So email is actually only one method. But I will say all of those other devices and all of those other methods, they're only getting me because city staff can't interact with your devices, your other communication forms as well, your social media, etc.
Yeah, yeah, of course. In your mind, there would be some budget set aside for an employee that would be a contract employee hired by the city councillor and that would do the constituency work. So kind of a hybrid model. There'd probably be some other staff back at City Hall, like the ones that you're describing, that you have access to that one half full-time equivalent, who are not supervised by you. They're supervised by civic administration and they're employees of the City of London.
I mean, there's debate around whether or not that just becomes a full constituent model where the counselor supervises the entirety of the role and they become political roles. And so that is something I personally am in favor of, but that's a different conversation for another
And
day.
again, it's not like you're inventing this. That is exactly what the mayor's office has. And then I guess if we do this, we'll call it the
Mhm.
constituency model. Um, do you see that as having an office then? A councillor would have an office in the ward in which they
I don't
represent?
necessarily think that's an expense that needs to be incurred, but I do always like the option, and I don't feel like I have this option per se, and other members of council wouldn't either, of using touchdown places like community centers or libraries or other places. So I do some of that myself. I tend to work from home a few days a week just so that I can be in the ward and do lots of meetings in and around the area. I find that helpful just for my own understanding of an issue, checking out up on something that maybe somebody has raised with me, etc.
Let's bring this all together. So there are a few ideas that
Yeah.
we've talked about today. One is counselor compensation. There's no question in my mind that many counselors work impossibly hard. I used to say that, a
Mhm.
counselor will work as hard as they choose to work, and there will never be a shortage of work. And so if you choose to work
Mhm.
70 hours a week, there will be 70 hours of work. If you choose to work 80 hours a week, I'm worried about you, but there will be 80
Absolutely.
hours of work. So we talk about compensation, and then we've talked about the number of counselors that would be on a
Mhm.
council. And your idea is if you were to shrink that, you'd
Mhm.
increase the workload, but you'd support it in a constituency model way and probably be supported with the budget that exists
Mhm.
today, because you'd be eliminating a number of counselors and all of the expenses that go along with each of them. That's a hard discussion for a council to have, because there's a saying that as the water in the pond lowers, the animals drinking from it look at each other a little differently.
Yeah, and that's why I do think we are creatures of the province, and the province needs to make these kinds of decisions. And like I said, they started to a number of years ago, the City of Toronto. And, Premier Ford has weighed in on council compensation before in other communities. I do think there is value in having this looked at provincially and setting a range and a target and doing that by size of a formula instead of having these conversations every so often.
Sure. And to extend the mathematic metaphor, you're really talking about order of operations here. And that it sounds to me like you're saying, look, this is good information. I appreciate the work from the task force, but let's hang on and let's not make a decision that is path dependent, going in potentially a different direction than the province will take somewhere down the road.
Well, I don't think the province has signaled where they're going with this conversation. That's part of the challenge, which is why London had to show some leadership on this in order to address it. When I was evaluating this decision, I was looking at that 70th percentile median income, and that I knew I wasn't going to be able to get behind. I did say, though, during debate, I would have supported additional stipend for sitting on agencies, boards, and commissions. I do think that there is value there. The reason I said that I would support that is it's important for us as council to consider what we benchmark against. We set the tone for other negotiations and decisions that happen in the city, not just at City Hall, but across multiple sectors. And so for me, I was looking at this from a holistic perspective, looking at the compensation for sitting on an agency board and commission was an important step that we needed to take in furthering our evaluation. The task force didn't recommend that approach. They said part of it was that they would have to evaluate the workload associated with each of those agencies, boards, and commissions and come up with kind of a stratified list of which ones were heavier workloads, more responsibility, et cetera. I think we had some of that information already. We had already started to look at what hours were required, what types of decisions were being evaluated in order for us to come up with a list like that. So I think that could have been future work that we could have done in order to set that amount. And we also had something to use as a starting point, because surrounding municipalities who have seats at the table at some of these agencies, boards, and commissions already do receive a stipend.
No, no, that's true. And this is
Yes.
ancient history. Way back, I think in around the year 2000, counselors were compensated to sit on boards and commissions. And in many cases, they're working with people who are being compensated at, some reasonable and some fairly significant levels to sit on the board. The police service board, for example, I believe each police service board member receives about a $7,000 stipend. It could have gone up since my time on council, and the chair receives an over $10,000 stipend. And if you're an elected official from the City of London sitting on that board, then you're not compensated anything beyond the rate of pay that you receive through your work as a city councillor. And the catch, I think, also is that there are sometimes we'll have a situation where a council member doesn't sit on any committees or sits on very few committees outside of their work as a councillor. And that means that other councillors need to take on more responsibilities. And so are you thinking that that would be a way to incentivize the work that's happening on those committees?
Yes. So, what we heard when the compensation task force was looking at this item, what we were hearing was, well, it will help to address unequal workload, looking at compensation. And I couldn't get behind that from the perspective that if you're looking at incentivizing work, then it made sense to use the agency's boards and commissions stipend as a way to incentivize the work.
Right. So you have a lower starting salary, and then
Yeah.
if you take on a role as a committee chair, you receive some compensation for that. If you take on some really complex work at complicated boards like the Police Service Board, I'll give one example, or London Hydro that you sit on now, then you're compensated for that as well. So it can be kind of a sliding scale.
Yes, and it would mean putting less into base, and I think that that to me was a way that I was looking at finding a way forward so that I could still support some of the recommendation, but not to the 35% level that was put forward.
But let's sort of finish this conversation off here. This is going to council this week. What exactly are the decisions that council will be making?
From here, the recommendations that came out of SPPC, which is the acceptance of the task force report. The only amendment really outside of the recommendations that were put forward was to amend severance. And so the task force, so I did bring this issue up to council when we were putting together the terms of reference for the task force, because we were having this discussion of is council, or should council be, the role of a councillor be considered a full-time role? And then the discussion became, is it a full-time job? And so as that discussion played out, one of the points that I brought up is when we start to talk about it as a full-time job, does it have Employment Standards Act's consequences? And so that to me was the reason why, as we started down this path, and I kept hearing council say that they were looking, or councillors saying that they were looking at it as a full-time role going forward, instead of the unique position that it is under the guiding principles right now. If that's the case, then do we need to look at the idea of severance? Because that's part of what most people have in a full-time employment contract. So from there, that severance discussion went to the task force. The task force did not recommend severance. That was amended into the decision that came forward at SPPC and was supported by the majority to move forward to the council discussion as well.
Right. So folks at home know it's a 4-week severance that would be paid. So it would be about a $10,000 cost, and it's basically providing bridge funding as the councillor looks for new work after they, I guess, lost their election.
So the way it's worded right now, it says at the time of losing an election.
Okay, so you have to lose to get $10,000. Okay.
Yeah. So what I said about this is, in the task force report, it says the only method of evaluation of a councillor is at the time of an election. So let's say at the time of an election, you do not get reelected. It usually means that people didn't support the work you did as a councillor. And so then we're going to reward you with a severance.
Right.
So isn't that similar to rewarding for poor performance?
Right. I gotcha. Yeah, it makes perfect sense, the point that you're making. Councillor Rahman, thanks so much for your time today. We're out of it. I've saved about 60 seconds, so you can have the last word.
Yes, thank you. So again, with the utmost respect for my colleagues and the task force for their work, I arrived at my decision for a number of reasons. The majority of what I was looking at was how do we create opportunities for council where we're able to look at this discussion around a salary increase in a way that's affordable for our city as well. Affordability is part of every discussion we're having as a council right now, and it has to be at a time where we're also talking about our salaries. So I hope that council will consider this as we go into our final decision at council.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. And I mentioned off the top that if all of these decisions were made, it could go from essentially a budget that is 50% larger. I really appreciate the time that you took. I know that you don't have a lot of it.
Yes, one thing I wanted to mention, I don't know if you included it in your opening or not, but I still am a professor at Fanshawe College. So I do say that. I think it's important for people to understand that, yes, I still have a full-time job. I know people are talking about on social media that, will I be able to be a professor still or not? How will that be interpreted? All that other stuff. So I'm not trying to hide that fact. I've always been very open.
Yeah. Well, thanks for raising it. I'll make sure it gets included on the podcast. And let's leave it there. Thanks again for coming on the show, and good luck next week.
Yes, thanks again. Take care.
And we'll be back with more right after this. Fall is here. It's time to discover Bicycle Cafe. Cozy up with our daily soup and sandwich, or unwind with an evening latte and some Dutch comfort food.
London Bicycle Cafe at the Forks of the Thames. See you soon.
Well, that's the show. And as always, I hope you know a little bit more about council salaries than you did off the top. I said it during the interview, and I'll say it again. Most councillors work impossibly hard. Essentially, they can be as busy as they choose to be. There's always more to do. They work hard to get elected, too. It's a months-long job interview full of intensity, and there's an equally long performance appraisal every 4 years called an election. I'm not here to say whether the numbers we were discussing are too high or too low. I will say it's a big change and it's worth talking about. The decision, though, is this current city council's call. They took on this responsibility when we elected them, and ultimately the voters will decide if it was the right call in the coming election scheduled for October 2026. Many thanks to Councillor Rahman for joining us, and as always, thank you for listening. If you like what you're hearing, please tell your friends and family. You can also subscribe wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't visited the show website, I invite you to do so. The address is themattbrownpodcast.com. And if you have any questions about this episode or a comment about a previous episode, please visit the website and send it in. The messages come directly to me. I'll read every one of them, and I'll respond when I can too. And that's the show. I'm Matt Brown, and this is the Matt Brown Podcast. Thanks for listening. Bye for now. Talk to you again soon. London.